If you liked this story, make sure to like and subscribe for a part 2. Also, in order to strengthen our community, I would like to know where you are watching from and what time you are currently watching this video. Jason Pierce had always been proud of his life. He was the kind of man who believed in traditional values, small-town loyalty, and a clear sense of hierarchy. His beliefs weren't something he kept hidden either. Jason was a vocal man, some would say outspoken, about what he believed was right and wrong in the world. And one of those things he believed strongly was that people should stay in their place. In his mind, certain boundaries weren't meant to be crossed, and when they were, it made him sick. That's why, when he first heard whispers about his wife's new boss, Andre Hayes, Jason's blood ran cold. Andre was a tech billionaire, one of those self-made types who had risen to prominence almost overnight. He owned a sprawling business empire that included everything from luxury real estate to high-end software development. But the thing that gnawed at Jason wasn't Andre's money, it was his skin color. Jason could never stomach the idea of someone like Andre being in a position of power, especially over his wife, Emily. Emily had been working as Andre's personal assistant for just over 6 months. At first, Jason hadn't thought much of it. She was excited about the new job, and the money was certainly good. Emily had mentioned Andre from time to time, usually in the context of how demanding and difficult he could be as a boss. But as the months wore on, Jason noticed something unsettling. Emily was working longer hours, staying late at the office, and coming home exhausted, both mentally and physically. One evening, when Emily walked through the front door well past midnight, Jason's suspicions boiled over. He'd been stewing all evening, the TV on in the background, but he wasn't watching. Instead, his mind had been replaying every strange comment Emily had made about her job in recent months. The way she said Andre's name, the way she seemed nervous whenever he asked about her work. She dropped her bag on the table, letting out a tired sigh. Her blonde hair was disheveled, and her makeup was smudged as if she'd been rubbing her eyes all night. Jason stood up, his body rigid with tension. "Where the hell have you been, Emily?" Jason's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet. She blinked, clearly surprised by the aggression in his tone. "At work," she said, her voice soft, as if stating the obvious. "You know how things are with Andre. He's always keeping me late." Jason's jaw clenched. "Yeah, I know how things are with Andre," he snapped. "I'm not stupid, Emily. Something's going on. You're never home on time anymore. You don't even answer your phone half the time when I call you. What the hell is going on between you two?" Emily's face paled, and she quickly shook her head. "Jason, no, nothing is going on. He's just demanding. That's all. It's part of the job. You know how much this position means to me." Jason wasn't convinced. He stepped closer, towering over her as he glared into her eyes, searching for any sign of deception. "You think I don't see the way you act when you talk about him? The way you get all fidgety? You're hiding something." Emily swallowed hard, taking a step back. "Jason, you're being paranoid. I told you, it's just work. He's my boss, and yes, it's stressful, but that's it." Jason's heart was pounding now, anger rising like a tidal wave inside him. "I don't buy it," he growled. "I'm not an idiot, Emily. There's something else going on, and I'm going to find out what it is. And if that," he stopped himself, the bile rising in his throat. "If that black bastard is laying a hand on you." Emily's eyes widened in shock, and she shook her head violently. "Jason, stop it. You're being ridiculous. You can't just assume." But Jason wasn't listening anymore. His mind was racing, filled with images of Andre and Emily together, of his wife being manipulated, or worse, by this powerful man. He stormed past her, grabbing his phone off the coffee table. His fingers fumbled as he dialed the number of his friend, Paul, who worked as a private investigator. Paul, Jason barked into the phone. "I need you to do something for me. My wife's boss, Andre Hayes. I want you to dig up everything you can on him. Follow him, follow her, whatever it takes. I want to know what's really going on." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Paul responded, his voice cautious. "Jason, you sure about this? That sounds a bit extreme, man. You might not like what you find." "I don't care." Jason nearly shouted, his hand trembling as he gripped the phone. "Just do it." He hung up before Paul could say anything else, turning to face Emily, who stood frozen, her face pale. "You've got some explaining to do," Jason growled. "And I'm going to get to the bottom of it." The tension between them was suffocating as Emily tried to compose herself. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jason cut her off. "You better hope I don't find out what I think is going on," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "Because if I do, things are going to get real ugly." Over the next few days, Jason's paranoia grew. Every time Emily left the house for work, he felt his rage building, imagining her with Andre, this man who had everything Jason despised: wealth, power, and influence over his wife. He barely slept, the knot in his stomach tightening with each passing hour. He checked his phone constantly, waiting for updates from Paul. And then, the call came. It was late afternoon, and Jason was sitting in his truck, parked in an empty lot near his house. The phone buzzed in his hand, and he quickly answered. "Paul?" Jason's voice was tense. Paul hesitated for a moment before responding. "I've been following them," he said slowly. "You're not going to like this, Jason." Jason's grip tightened on the phone. "Tell me." "They've been meeting up outside of work," Paul continued. "Late at night. Restaurants, private meetings in his office after hours. It looks bad." Jason's vision blurred with anger, his entire body trembling as Paul's words sank in. He knew it. He'd known it all along. His wife had been lying to him. And that black bastard, Andre, was behind it. "Where are they right now?" Jason demanded, his voice shaking. "They're at his penthouse downtown," Paul said quietly. "I don't know what's happening inside, but they've been there for hours." Jason didn't need to hear any more. He hung up the phone, his pulse pounding in his ears. Without thinking, he reached for the glove compartment, pulling out the handgun he kept there. His mind was a whirlwind of fury, betrayal, and something darker. He couldn't think straight, but he didn't care. He was going to put an end to this, tonight. Jason's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, the gun now resting on the passenger seat beside him. He didn't feel the cool leather under his hands. All he felt was the burn of betrayal searing through his veins. He had never imagined this would be his life. The thought that his wife, the woman he had married, had taken vows with, was sneaking around with a man like Andre, a man who represented everything Jason despised, was more than he could handle. He took a deep breath, but it did nothing to calm him. His heart raced with the rhythm of the engine as he sped through the streets toward downtown. The city lights blurred past, but Jason's focus was razor-sharp, locked on one target, Andre Hayes. The billionaire's penthouse sat at the top of one of the tallest, most luxurious buildings in the city. It was the kind of place Jason could never afford, the kind of place where men like Andre could afford to play by their own rules. Jason's thoughts were a storm of rage and confusion. He pictured Emily in that penthouse, with Andre, laughing, touching, betraying everything they had built together. Every time he imagined them together, his vision clouded with red. He had to put a stop to this, once and for all. As Jason neared the building, he spotted it from a distance. The sleek glass tower rose into the sky like a monument to wealth and power, its windows gleaming under the city lights. He clenched his teeth, gripping the gun with his right hand as he parked the truck a few blocks away, out of sight. He stepped out of the vehicle, shoving the gun into his jacket pocket as he walked briskly toward the building. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to get inside. This was no ordinary apartment complex. Andre Hayes' building had security, and Jason didn't have time to waste. But luck, it seemed, was on his side. As he approached the entrance, a delivery driver stepped out of the building, leaving the door ajar. Jason seized the opportunity, slipping inside before anyone could notice. The lobby was sleek and modern, marble floors reflecting the soft glow of designer chandeliers. Jason's boots clacked loudly on the polished surface, but he didn't care. His gaze darted around the room, searching for the elevator. He spotted it in the corner, a gleaming set of doors with a panel that required a keycard. Cursing under his breath, he glanced toward the front desk, where a security guard sat flipping through a magazine, oblivious to Jason's presence. Jason's pulse quickened as he realized he couldn't just walk up to the guard and ask for access. He needed to be smart, or this would end before it even began. As he moved toward a decorative plant near the elevator, hiding from the guard's view, his mind worked frantically. And then, another stroke of luck, a well-dressed woman stepped out of the elevator, holding the door open for a moment as she fumbled with her bag. Jason didn't think twice. He rushed forward, sliding into the elevator just before the doors shut. The woman gave him a brief, startled look but said nothing as she exited. Jason hit the button for the top floor, his heart hammering in his chest. Each passing second felt like an eternity as the elevator ascended toward the penthouse. His hand hovered over the gun in his jacket, his mind replaying every moment of the last few days, the late nights, the excuses, the lies. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open to reveal a private hallway, lined with thick carpet and expensive art. Jason stepped out, his boots sinking into the plush flooring. At the end of the hall was a single door, guarded by an ornate security system. Jason approached cautiously, feeling the weight of the gun pressing against his side. His breath came in shallow bursts as he considered his options. He wasn't exactly known for subtlety, and breaking into a place like this would be nearly impossible without setting off alarms. But he was desperate. Suddenly, the door opened. Jason froze, his heart nearly stopping in his chest. Standing in the doorway was Andre Hayes himself, dressed in a tailored suit that fit his muscular frame perfectly. Andre's deep brown eyes locked onto Jason's with a cold, measured gaze, and for a moment, neither man moved. "What the hell are you doing here?" Andre's voice was calm but laced with suspicion. Jason felt a surge of adrenaline as he took a step forward, his hand instinctively gripping the gun. "Where's my wife?" Jason growled, his voice thick with anger. Andre didn't flinch. He crossed his arms over his chest, his expression unreadable. "Your wife," he said, his tone cool and detached. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jason's temper flared. He could feel the blood rushing to his head as he took another step closer. "Don't lie to me. I know she's here, Andre. I know what's been going on between you two. You think you can just take what's mine because you're some rich piece of..." Before Jason could finish, the door behind Andre swung open wider, and there she was, Emily. Her eyes were wide with shock, her face pale as she stepped out into the hallway. "Jason, what are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jason's heart nearly stopped. Seeing her there, standing beside Andre, was more than he could take. His hand tightened on the gun in his pocket, and he felt a wave of rage crash over him. "You lied to me," he said, his voice shaking. "You've been sneaking around with him. You've been cheating on me with this. Jason, stop." Emily's voice was sharp, cutting through his accusations. "It's not what you think. You're not thinking straight." Andre stood silently, watching the scene unfold with an eerie calm. His posture was relaxed, but there was a tension in the air that made Jason's skin crawl. He couldn't believe the audacity of this man, standing there like he had done nothing wrong, like he hadn't destroyed Jason's marriage. Jason took another step forward, his hand tightening on the gun. "I'm not letting you get away with this," he growled. "I swear to God, I'll." Before he could finish, there was a sudden, loud click. Jason froze, realizing too late that Andre wasn't just standing there. He was armed too. In one smooth motion, Andre had pulled a sleek black pistol from under his jacket, and it was now aimed directly at Jason's chest. "Think very carefully about your next move," Andre said, his voice cold and steady. Jason's heart raced as he stared down the barrel of the gun, his own hand still wrapped around his weapon. The tension between the two men crackled like electricity in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like the hallway had become a battleground. The hallway was silent, save for the sound of Jason's ragged breathing. His mind was racing, but his body felt frozen, locked in place as he stared down the barrel of Andre's gun. The realization that this man, this supposed billionaire, had been prepared for him sent a fresh wave of fury through Jason's veins. How long had Andre been planning for this confrontation? How long had he known Jason would come for him? Behind Andre, Emily's wide eyes flickered with fear and something else, guilt, maybe. Jason couldn't tear his gaze away from her, the woman he had vowed to protect, the woman he had trusted. How could she stand there, allowing this man to point a gun at her husband? His hand twitched, the weight of the gun in his pocket burning into his palm. "Put it down, Jason," Andre said, his voice still calm, still in control. "You don't want this to end badly for you." Jason's lip curled in disgust. "End badly? You think you can just point a gun at me, take my wife, and walk away? You don't know who you're messing with." Emily took a step forward, her hand raised as if to calm him. "Jason, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Just listen to him. We can figure this out. You don't have to do this." Jason's rage boiled over. "Figure this out," he barked. "You think we're just going to sit down and talk about this? After everything you've done, after you've been sneaking around with him," his voice cracked with emotion, the betrayal cutting deeper than he ever imagined. Emily shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not what you think. Andre and I. It's not like that. Not like that." Jason's laughter was bitter, harsh. "I'm supposed to believe that? After everything? After the lies? The late nights? What the hell am I supposed to think?" Andre's grip on his gun never wavered. "This is your last chance, Jason," he said quietly. "Put the gun down and walk away. This can end without anyone getting hurt." But Jason wasn't hearing any of it. His mind was a whirlwind of anger, humiliation, and hurt. His grip on his own gun tightened, and for a moment, his finger hovered over the trigger. It would be so easy, just one pull, and it would all be over. He'd take Andre out, make him pay for what he'd done. But then what? What would happen after? His eyes darted back to Emily, who stood frozen between him and Andre, her expression torn between fear and desperation. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the lies, Jason still loved her. The thought of her getting caught in the crossfire made him hesitate. His breathing slowed, and for a brief moment, clarity broke through the haze of his anger. But then Andre spoke again, and the rage came roaring back. "You think this is about you, Jason?" Andre's tone was almost mocking now, his lips curling into a small, cold smile. "This was never about you. You're just in the way. In the way." The words hit Jason like a slap to the face. This man wasn't just taking his wife, he was erasing him, dismissing him as if he were nothing, as if his life didn't matter. Jason's vision blurred with fury, and before he knew it, his hand was moving. "Jason, no." Emily screamed, but it was too late. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the hallway like a thunderclap, deafening and final. For a split second, everything was frozen in time. Jason's arm was outstretched, the gun in his hand still smoking from the shot he had fired. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. Andre stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder where the bullet had grazed him. Blood seeped through his expensive suit, staining the fabric dark red, but he remained standing, his face twisted in pain and fury. Jason's eyes widened in disbelief. He had shot him, but not fatally. Andre was still alive, and still armed. Before Jason could react, Andre raised his own gun, his eyes burning with rage. "Big mistake," he growled, and pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and Jason barely had time to move. The bullet struck his side, the force of it knocking him backward against the wall. Pain exploded through his body, and he gasped, clutching his ribs as he sank to the floor. His vision swam, the edges of the hallway darkening as the pain overwhelmed him. "Jason!" Emily screamed, rushing toward him. Her hands were on him, trying to staunch the flow of blood, but Jason could barely focus on her. His chest heaved as he fought to breathe, his mind clouded with agony. Andre stepped forward, his gun still trained on Jason, though his own injury slowed his movements. Blood dripped from his shoulder, but he didn't seem to care. His eyes were cold, calculating, as he looked down at Jason. "You should have walked away," Andre said quietly. "Now look at you." Jason tried to speak, tried to say something, anything, but the pain was too much. His fingers twitched around the gun still in his hand, but he didn't have the strength to lift it. Emily turned to Andre, her face streaked with tears. "Please," she begged. "Please don't kill him. Just let him go. He wasn't thinking. It's my fault. This is all my fault." Andre hesitated, his eyes flickering between Emily and Jason. For a moment, Jason thought he might actually lower the gun, might actually show some mercy. But then Andre shook his head, his expression hardening once more. "No," Andre said firmly. "This ends now." He raised the gun again, aiming directly at Jason's head. Jason's mind raced. In the span of a few seconds, 1,000 thoughts ran through his head. This was it. This was how it was going to end. After everything, after all the years he had spent with Emily, after all the fights, the love, the memories, it was going to end like this. Shot in a hallway by a man he despised, a man who had taken everything from him. But as Andre's finger tightened on the trigger, something unexpected happened. A loud crash echoed through the hallway as the door at the other end of the corridor burst open. Jason's vision was blurry, but he could make out the figures of several men rushing in, armed men. The sound of gunfire erupted, and chaos ensued. Andre spun around, firing back at the intruders, but he was outnumbered. Bullets flew through the air, shattering the expensive artwork on the walls and ricocheting off the marble floors. Jason barely had time to process what was happening before a stray bullet grazed his leg, sending another shock of pain through his body. In the midst of the gunfight, Emily screamed, covering her head as she crouched beside Jason, trying to shield him from the hail of bullets. Jason's heart raced, adrenaline pumping through his veins as he struggled to stay conscious. The sounds of gunfire and shouting filled the air, but all he could think about was Emily, huddled beside him, crying as the world seemed to collapse around them. The hallway had turned into a war zone. Bullets flew, ricocheting off the walls and shattering glass as Andre exchanged fire with the armed men who had burst into the building. The deafening sound of gunfire echoed, punctuated by the sharp cries of Emily, who was crouched next to Jason, shielding him with her body as best as she could. Jason's world was spinning, the pain in his side radiating through his entire body. Blood soaked his shirt, his breath shallow and labored. His mind struggled to process the chaos around him. Who were these men? Why had they come now? Were they after Andre, or was this some cruel twist of fate, an escalation in a battle he hadn't even known he was fighting? Andre moved with the precision of a trained soldier, firing off rounds as he ducked behind a decorative column in the hallway. His face was set in a grimace of concentration, the wound in his shoulder barely slowing him down. Whoever these men were, they weren't here to talk, and Andre wasn't going down without a fight. Jason's grip on his gun loosened as his strength faded. He tried to lift it, to aim at Andre again, but his arm felt like lead. His vision blurred in and out of focus as the sounds of the battle became a distant roar. Emily's hands were on his chest, her voice shaking as she whispered his name over and over, begging him to stay with her. "Jason, please. Don't leave me," she cried, her tears falling onto his face. He wanted to respond, to tell her he wasn't going anywhere, but the words wouldn't come. His body felt heavy, as if the weight of everything, the pain, the betrayal, the violence, was pulling him under. Suddenly, the gunfire stopped. The hallway fell eerily silent, save for the soft hum of the building's ventilation system and the distant sound of sirens approaching. Jason's mind struggled to catch up with what had just happened. Through the haze of pain and confusion, he saw the armed men stepping over the bodies of Andre's security detail, who had apparently been taken out in the crossfire. One of the men, a tall, muscular figure dressed in black tactical gear, approached Andre, his gun raised and ready. Andre, now leaning against the column, blood seeping from multiple wounds, glared at the intruder with a defiant sneer. "Who the hell are you?" Andre spat, his voice hoarse with pain and exhaustion. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, his face hidden behind a black mask. Without a word, he raised his gun and fired a single shot. The bullet struck Andre in the chest, and he collapsed to the floor, the life draining from his eyes almost instantly. Jason watched in stunned silence as Andre Hayes, the man who had turned his life upside down, lay dead on the floor. The billionaire who had seemed so untouchable, so invincible, was now just a lifeless body in an expensive suit. The masked man lowered his gun and turned his attention to Jason and Emily. Emily's body tensed, her eyes wide with fear as the man approached them. Jason struggled to stay conscious, his mind racing with questions. Who were these people? Why had they killed Andre? And what were they going to do to him and Emily? The man knelt down beside Jason, his eyes, cold and calculating, barely visible through the slits in his mask. "You're lucky we came when we did," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "If we hadn't, you'd be dead by now." Jason tried to respond, but the pain was too much. His vision blurred again, and he felt himself slipping into unconsciousness. He could barely make out the man's next words. "Take them," the masked man ordered his team. "We need to get out of here before the cops arrive." Before Jason could protest, two of the armed men grabbed him by the arms, lifting him off the ground. The sudden movement sent a fresh wave of agony through his body, and he cried out in pain. Emily clung to him, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Where are you taking us?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking with fear. The masked man glanced at her but didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for his men to move. They half-dragged, half-carried Jason toward the emergency exit at the end of the hallway, with Emily following close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. Jason's head lolled to the side as they moved, his consciousness fading in and out. He could hear the distant wail of police sirens growing louder, but the armed men moved quickly, their actions methodical and precise. Within minutes, they had navigated the maze of hallways and stairwells, emerging into a dimly lit underground parking garage. A black SUV waited for them, its engine already running. The men shoved Jason into the back seat, Emily scrambling in beside him, her hands never leaving his body. She whispered his name, her voice breaking with worry, but Jason could barely focus. His vision swam as he fought to stay awake, every breath sending sharp pains through his ribs. The masked man climbed into the driver's seat, and without a word, the SUV sped off into the night, leaving the chaos of the penthouse behind. The city streets blurred past the windows as they drove, the sirens growing fainter in the distance. Jason drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind filled with fragmented images of what had just happened. Andre's face, twisted in pain and fury. The gunfire. Emily's tears. The cold, merciless eyes of the masked man who had saved him, only to whisk him away to an unknown fate. Where were they taking him? And why? He wanted to ask, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. His body felt heavy, his eyelids drooping as exhaustion and pain took their toll. Emily's voice was the last thing he heard before he finally gave in to the darkness. "Jason, stay with me, please. Don't leave me. I need you." And then, everything went black. Jason awoke to the sound of murmured voices, the smell of antiseptic, and the faint hum of machinery. His head throbbed, and his body felt numb, but the pain in his side had lessened. Slowly, he opened his eyes, blinking against the harsh fluorescent light that filled the room. He was in a hospital bed, hooked up to an 4-and-a-heart monitor. The steady beeping of the machine was the only sound in the sterile room. His mouth was dry, and his throat felt raw, but he managed to turn his head slightly, searching for Emily. She was there, sitting in a chair beside his bed, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked exhausted, but when she saw that he was awake, she shot up from her seat, rushing to his side. "Jason," she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. "Thank God you're awake." He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. Emily quickly grabbed a cup of water from the bedside table and held it to his lips, helping him take a few small sips. The cool liquid soothed his parched throat, and after a moment, he found his voice. Where are we?" he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily's eyes darted to the door, as if she were afraid someone might hear them. She leaned in closer, her voice low and urgent. "We're in a private hospital. Those men, they brought us here after they killed Andre. I don't know who they are, but they said you'd be safe here." Jason's mind reeled as he tried to process her words. Safe? Why would these men go through so much trouble to save him, only to dump him in a hospital and disappear? None of it made sense. Before he could ask any more questions, the door to the room swung open, and the masked man from before stepped inside. The masked man strode into the hospital room with an air of authority, his presence instantly chilling the sterile atmosphere. His face was now uncovered, revealing sharp features, dark eyes, a chiseled jawline, and a look of cold calculation. He wore the same black tactical gear, though his demeanor suggested that this wasn't just a rescue mission, there was something much deeper at play. Emily instinctively stepped closer to Jason, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling but resolute. "Why did you help us? What do you want?" The man didn't answer right away. He crossed the room in measured steps, his boots clicking softly against the tile floor. He glanced briefly at Jason, who lay weak and still recovering in the hospital bed, then turned his attention back to Emily. His gaze was intense, almost piercing, as if he could see right through her. "My name is Malcolm," he finally said, his voice low but firm. "Let's just say I have interests that align with yours." Jason stirred, his body still heavy with exhaustion and pain, but his mind slowly coming back to life. He struggled to sit up, wincing as a sharp stab of pain shot through his side. "What the hell do you mean, interests that align?" he rasped, his voice hoarse. Malcolm pulled up a chair, sitting down with the calm precision of someone used to controlling situations. "Andre Hayes wasn't just a billionaire," he began, locking eyes with Jason. "He was involved in things that would make your skin crawl. Dirty business deals, trafficking, money laundering. He had connections that reached far beyond this city. You were just a small piece of a much larger puzzle." Jason's mind whirled as he processed Malcolm's words. He had come to confront Andre over Emily, over what he thought was just a personal betrayal. But now, it seemed, there was something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. Emily frowned, clearly confused. But what does this have to do with us? With Jason? Malcolm leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing. Andre was being watched, tracked by people who don't take kindly to loose ends. He was becoming a liability. When you went to confront him, you triggered a series of events that put both of your lives in danger. Those men you saw in the penthouse, they weren't just hired muscle. They were part of a larger network. Jason's stomach churned. The gunfight, the sudden attack, it all made sense now. He had walked into a situation far bigger than he had ever imagined. But why had they been spared? Why had Malcolm and his men intervened? "You saved us," Jason said, his voice strained. "But why? What do you want from us?" Malcolm's expression softened ever so slightly, though the cold calculation never fully left his eyes. "Let's just say, I need your help," he replied. "I need you to finish what you started." Jason's brow furrowed in confusion. "Finish? What the hell are you talking about? I never started anything. I went there to confront him about my wife, not to get involved in whatever criminal empire he was running." Malcolm's gaze shifted to Emily for a brief moment before returning to Jason. "That may be true," he said. "But now, you're involved whether you like it or not. Andre Hayes was part of something much bigger, and there are people who will come looking for answers. They'll want to know what happened to him, and they'll be looking at you." Emily's face went pale. "What? No, we didn't do anything wrong. We were just—" "You were there," Malcolm interrupted, his voice cutting through her protests. "That's all that matters. In their eyes, you're guilty by association." Jason's fists clenched under the sheets, anger flaring in his chest. "So what? You expect us to just clean up your mess? We didn't ask for any of this." Malcolm stood up, towering over both of them with an air of authority. "No, you didn't. But now you have a choice. You can either run, hide, and spend the rest of your lives looking over your shoulders, or you can help me take down the rest of them." Jason's mind raced. The idea of being hunted, of always having to look over his shoulder, terrified him. But the alternative, getting deeper into this world of crime and corruption, was equally horrifying. Emily's hand gripped his, her face tight with fear and uncertainty. "Jason, what are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He looked into her eyes, seeing the desperation there, the fear that had taken hold of both of them since that fateful night. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make this nightmare go away. But one thing was clear, running wasn't an option. They had already been drawn too far into this web of deceit. Jason turned back to Malcolm, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. "What do you need us to do?" Malcolm's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. "Good. I knew you'd see things my way." He pulled a small device from his pocket, a sleek, black earpiece. He handed it to Jason. "Keep this with you at all times. You'll be hearing from me soon." Jason stared at the device in his hand, the weight of the situation settling over him like a heavy fog. He was in too deep now, trapped in a world he didn't understand. But there was no turning back. Malcolm headed toward the door, pausing just before he left. "You'll be contacted soon," he repeated. "And remember, if you try to run, you won't make it far." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Jason and Emily alone in the hospital room, the air thick with tension. Emily sank into the chair beside Jason's bed, her face buried in her hands. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Jason stared at the ceiling, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The pain in his side throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat, a constant reminder of how close he had come to death. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "Jason," Emily said, lifting her tear-streaked face to look at him. "Do you think we can trust him?" Jason hesitated. Trust wasn't a word he could easily associate with Malcolm or anything he'd just learned. But what choice did they have? If they didn't follow through, they'd be hunted, constantly looking over their shoulders, as Malcolm had warned. I don't know, Jason admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. But for now, we don't have a choice. The days that followed passed in a blur. Jason's recovery was slow, the wound in his side healing but leaving him weak. Emily stayed by his side constantly, her anxiety growing with each passing moment. They spoke in hushed tones, afraid that Malcolm, or worse, whoever was watching them, might be listening. Jason knew that their lives would never return to normal. The life they had before, the quiet suburban house, the mundane routines, felt like a distant memory. Now, they were pawns in a game they didn't understand, a game with deadly stakes. And then, one night, the call came. Jason was resting in the hospital bed, his body still sore but his mind sharper than it had been in days. Emily sat beside him, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The room was dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of the machines monitoring Jason's vitals. Suddenly, the earpiece Malcolm had given him crackled to life. "It's time," Malcolm's voice whispered through the device. "Are you ready?" Jason's heart raced. He glanced at Emily, who had heard the faint sound of Malcolm's voice. She gave him a worried look but nodded, her trust in him unwavering despite everything. Jason took a deep breath and pressed the earpiece closer to his ear. "I'm ready," he whispered back. Jason's pulse quickened as Malcolm's voice filled his ear. "Meet me at the location I'm sending you now," Malcolm instructed, his tone clipped and cold. The phone vibrated in Jason's hand as a message came through, displaying an address in a remote part of the city, a place Jason didn't recognize. Emily watched him with wide eyes, her expression a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Jason, we don't know what we're walking into," she whispered, clutching his hand tightly. "This could be a trap. We can't trust him." Jason nodded, but deep down, he knew they had no choice. "We've come this far, Em. If we back out now, we'll spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders." His voice was resolute, though inside he felt a storm of uncertainty. "We need to see this through." With Malcolm's instructions clear, Jason and Emily made their way out of the hospital under the cover of night. The air was thick with tension, every shadow in the darkened parking lot feeling like a potential threat. Jason's hand rested on the gun Malcolm's men had left in the hospital room, just in case. Emily stayed close to him, her face pale and strained, but she didn't waver. She was in this as deeply as Jason was now, and they were about to confront something far larger and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The drive to the address Malcolm had sent was filled with a suffocating silence. The city lights faded into the distance as they left the familiar urban landscape behind, heading toward an industrial part of town. Abandoned factories and warehouses loomed in the darkness like the skeletons of a forgotten age. It felt like they were venturing into the heart of the unknown. When they finally arrived at the location, Jason pulled the car to a stop outside a dilapidated warehouse. The building was massive, its windows broken, and graffiti covered the crumbling walls. A faint light flickered from within, casting long shadows on the ground. "This is it," Jason muttered, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He glanced at Emily, who was staring at the warehouse with wide, anxious eyes. "Jason, what if we're walking into something we can't get out of?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the engine idling. Jason reached over, taking her hand in his. "We stick together. No matter what happens, we'll get through this." Emily nodded, though her face was etched with fear. Jason stepped out of the car, his body still aching from his injuries, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He scanned the area, noting that no other cars were parked nearby, no signs of life except for the faint glow coming from inside the warehouse. As they approached the large metal door, it creaked open, and Malcolm stepped out. He was dressed in all black, his face expressionless as he motioned for them to enter. You made it, he said, his voice as emotionless as ever. Jason exchanged a wary glance with Emily before stepping inside, his hand instinctively hovering near the concealed gun beneath his jacket. Emily stayed close behind, her every step hesitant. The warehouse's interior was as decrepit as the outside. Large steel beams crisscrossed the ceiling, while rusted machinery littered the floor. But in the center of the vast space stood a long table, illuminated by a single hanging light. A group of men stood around the table, their faces hidden in shadow. Jason's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of their gazes on him as Malcolm led them toward the table. The men didn't speak, but their presence was intimidating, filling the room with a palpable sense of danger. "Let's get straight to the point," Malcolm said, stopping at the edge of the table. He motioned toward a laptop sitting at the center. "Andre Hayes may be dead, but his empire isn't. His assets, his criminal network, it's all still operational. And there are people who would kill to get their hands on what's left." Jason's eyes flicked to the laptop. "So what does this have to do with us?" Malcolm tapped a few keys on the laptop, and the screen lit up with a complex web of names, numbers, and connections. It looked like a map of Andre's entire operation, an intricate network of illegal deals, offshore accounts, and powerful connections. "This is what we need to shut down," Malcolm said, his voice steely. "And you're going to help us do it." Jason stiffened, a cold knot forming in his gut. "How?" "I don't know anything about this world. I'm not a criminal. I came here to settle a personal matter, not to get involved in some underworld war." Malcolm's gaze hardened. "You don't have a choice anymore. You've seen too much, and now you're a loose end. The only way to protect yourself, and Emily, is to help me bring down the rest of Andre's organization." Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You're blackmailing us. You dragged us into this." Malcolm's eyes flashed with something akin to amusement, though his expression remained cold. "Blackmail? No. It's survival, pure and simple. If you don't help me, the people who are after Andre's empire will come after you. And they won't be as forgiving as I am." Jason felt his fists clench. His whole life had spiraled out of control, and now he was being forced into something he couldn't escape. But Malcolm was right, they couldn't run. The moment they walked away from this, they'd be hunted. He looked at Emily, her face pale but her eyes full of determination. She gave him a slight nod, and Jason knew what he had to do. He turned back to Malcolm, his jaw set. "Fine. What do you need us to do?" Malcolm gave a small, satisfied smile. "Good. I knew you'd come around." He gestured toward the laptop. "This network runs deep. We need to hit them where it hurts, take out their financial backbone, expose their operations. And that starts with this." He pulled up an account linked to a high-level associate of Andre's, a man Jason had never heard of before. "You're going to take this information," Malcolm said, his tone deadly serious, "and use it to destroy them from the inside." Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't a hacker, a spy, or anyone who could pull off something this dangerous. But Malcolm wasn't giving him a choice. He was thrust into this world, and now he had to play along. Emily, sensing his hesitation, stepped forward. "We'll do it," she said, her voice strong and steady. "But we need protection. You said you'd keep us safe." Malcolm's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry. As long as you're useful to me, you'll be protected. But the moment you try to run, or if you betray me in any way, well, you won't live long enough to regret it." Jason and Emily shared a tense glance, knowing they were in way over their heads. But there was no turning back now. They were about to enter a world they didn't understand, filled with dangers they couldn't anticipate. Malcolm handed Jason a flash drive, his expression unreadable. "This contains everything you need to get started." The clock is ticking, and we don't have time to waste. You're going to take down Andre's empire, piece by piece. Jason stared at the small device in his hand, feeling the weight of the task ahead. The darkness that had consumed their lives wasn't going away anytime soon. And now, they were on a collision course with forces far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Malcolm stepped back into the shadows, leaving Jason and Emily standing alone in the dimly lit warehouse. The silence was suffocating, and the gravity of their situation pressed down on them like a vice. Jason slipped the flash drive into his pocket, his mind racing with questions and fears. Emily stood beside him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a flicker of determination. They had no idea what they were about to face, but they knew one thing: they couldn't afford to fail. With a final glance at the empty warehouse, Jason turned and led Emily back to the car. The night air was thick with tension, and as they drove away from the warehouse, they both knew their lives had changed forever. As Jason and Emily drove through the desolate streets, the weight of their new reality pressed down harder with every passing second. They were now part of something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined, a deadly game where betrayal, corruption, and violence were the only rules. The quiet hum of the car engine did little to calm their nerves, and Jason's hands tightened around the steering wheel. "We're in too deep, Emily," Jason muttered, his voice strained. "I don't know if we can pull this off." Emily stared out the window, her mind racing as she tried to process everything that had happened. The memories of Andre's penthouse, the gunfight, and the threats from Malcolm swirled together in a chaotic blur. But she also knew they couldn't back down now. "We'll figure it out," she said quietly, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "We have to." The city seemed to stretch on endlessly, each block bringing them closer to the inevitable confrontation. Malcolm's words echoed in Jason's mind: "You're going to take them down from the inside." But how? They were just two ordinary people, thrust into a world of high-stakes crime with no real understanding of the danger they faced. Yet, Malcolm had given them no choice. As they approached their suburban neighborhood, the familiar streets felt eerie, almost foreign. The normalcy of their life before had been stripped away, replaced by fear and uncertainty. When they pulled into their driveway, Jason sat for a moment, staring at the house in front of him, the house that had once symbolized stability, love, and routine. Now, it was just a shell of what it had been, a place that no longer felt safe. Inside, the quiet was oppressive. Jason paced the living room, trying to make sense of the flash drive Malcolm had given them. He connected it to his laptop, and immediately, the screen was flooded with files, names, accounts, passwords, and coded messages. It was a treasure trove of information, the skeleton key to Andre's criminal empire. Emily stood behind him, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "What are we even looking for?" she asked, her voice tense. "How are we supposed to take down an entire network with just this?" Jason shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "But Malcolm thinks we can use this to hurt them. If we can expose what's in these accounts, money laundering, illegal deals, maybe we can force the people in charge to turn on each other." Emily's eyes widened as she looked at the list of names scrolling across the screen. "These people, they're powerful. If we make a move against them and it doesn't work, they'll kill us." Jason knew she was right. The people tied to Andre's empire weren't just criminals, they were wealthy, influential figures with connections that stretched far beyond the city. But they had no other choice. If they didn't act, Malcolm's threats would come true, and the others hunting them wouldn't stop until they were both dead. Suddenly, a soft knock at the door startled them both. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He immediately reached for the gun hidden beneath his jacket, motioning for Emily to stay back. The knock came again, this time, more insistent. Jason crept toward the door, his body tense, and peeked through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood on the other side, his face impassive but his posture rigid. He looked out of place in their quiet neighborhood, like a shadow from another world. Jason's grip on the gun tightened. He knew this couldn't be good. Slowly, he opened the door, keeping the gun hidden but ready. "Who are you?" Jason demanded, his voice hard. The man gave a cold smile, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I'm here on behalf of Mr. Hayes," he said calmly, though there was a threatening undertone to his words. "You have something that belongs to him." Jason's blood ran cold. Andre was dead, but clearly, his reach extended far beyond the grave. This man was part of the network, one of the dangerous individuals tied to Andre's empire. Jason knew they couldn't hand over the information, but they also couldn't afford to provoke this man. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jason replied, trying to sound convincing. "Andre's gone. We don't have anything." The man's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. "Don't lie to me," he warned, stepping closer. "You were there the night he died. You think we don't know that? You think we don't know what you took?" Jason felt his pulse quicken. The man wasn't just guessing, he knew everything. And if they didn't play this carefully, things could get very ugly very quickly. "You should leave," Jason said, his voice low and steady. "We don't want any trouble." The man's smile vanished completely, replaced by a cold, menacing stare. "You don't have a choice. If you don't give us what we want, you'll wish you'd never crossed paths with Mr. Hayes." Jason tensed, knowing this was about to escalate. Before he could respond, the man reached into his jacket, and in an instant, Jason's instincts kicked in. He pulled out his gun, aiming it directly at the man's chest. "Don't," Jason warned, his finger hovering over the trigger. The man froze, his hand still halfway to his jacket. For a brief moment, the two stood locked in a tense standoff, the air thick with the threat of violence. "Jason." Emily's voice cut through the tension, breaking the silence. She stepped into the hallway, her face pale but determined. "We can't do this," she pleaded. "We need to get out of here." The man's eyes flicked to Emily, a slow, predatory smile creeping back onto his face. "Smart woman," he said softly. "You should listen to her." Jason's mind raced. The man was dangerous, but killing him here would only make things worse. There were more like him, and if they killed one, others would come, stronger, more ruthless. This was a no-win situation. Suddenly, another figure appeared at the end of the driveway, a shadowy form that Jason instantly recognized. It was Malcolm, standing still as a statue, watching the scene unfold from a distance. Jason's stomach dropped. He hadn't even realized they were still being watched. "Go," Malcolm's voice rang out across the yard, his tone sharp and commanding. The man in the suit hesitated, clearly surprised by Malcolm's appearance. But he didn't argue. With one final, cold glance at Jason and Emily, he backed away, disappearing into the night like a ghost. Jason's hands trembled as he lowered the gun, his mind reeling from the encounter. Malcolm stepped forward, his eyes scanning the darkness where the man had disappeared. "I told you this wasn't over," Malcolm said quietly, his expression unreadable. "This is only the beginning." Jason looked at him, his heart still racing. He didn't know whether to thank Malcolm or fear him. Everything had spiraled out of control, and now they were deeper in the mess than ever before. Malcolm turned to Jason, his voice calm but filled with a warning. "You want to survive this? You follow my lead. Do exactly as I say. No more questions. No more hesitation." Jason swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the flash drive in his pocket. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Now, we take down the rest of them."